Welcome back to the YouTube channel of the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf. Today, we're delving deeper into the profound insights of meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. Your support means the world to us. We kindly ask you to like and share this audiobook, thus expanding its reach and allowing more people to benefit from its wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that you receive immediate notifications when new content is uploaded. Together, we can spread the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, cultivating a community dedicated to enlightenment and inner tranquility. We are sincerely grateful for your involvement in our mission to make these transformative teachings universally accessible. Let's now begin today's reading. The Heart to Keep Going. October 26, 2016. When the texts give maps for the practice, this can be in the canon or in the teachings of the Ajahns, they make it sound very smooth. Step by step, easy, smooth, one-directional practice, always endeavor up. But you look at your own practice, and it goes up and comes down, up and down. It's easy to get frustrated by that, but it's not wise. The wise attitude is to take things one step at a time, and to remember that the mind is a complex phenomenon. Ajahn Lee gives an analogy. He says that some people's minds are like banana trees. They have only one leaf to create, so they grow very fast. Large trees, though, have to create lots of branches and lots of leaves, so they grow slowly. So don't compare yourself with the texts, don't compare yourself with other people whose practice is like a banana tree and seems to be going faster than yours. After all, your practice is your practice. Their practice is theirs. Maybe yours is going to be a big tree. And whatever kind of tree it is, it's essential for your well-being. Also remember that we're not here just for the pleasure and the rapture that can come with concentration. We're here for all the other skills that go into training the mind. Each time you find the mind wandering off and you bring it back, that's strengthening a very essential skill, the skill to get your mind off a bad topic and bring it back to a good one. Even though this may happen many times, the fact that you're able to come back many times is a good sign. At the same time, you're also developing the observer inside, what in some circles they call meta-consciousness, the ability to watch your own mind, to observe your own mind from the outside, and not get sucked into all of its stories and moods. The moods and the stories are one thing, but your awareness is something else. Each time you pull out of a thought world, you strengthen that sense of the separate observer. And that's a very useful skill as you go through the day. Sometimes it's difficult to take the sense of ease you get in meditation and carry it off the cushion back into daily life. Sometimes it happens easily, but sometimes it's hard. But what you can take all the time are the skills of not just riding with your mind in whichever direction it wants to run. And even though it may still run for a while, the fact that you're pulling back a little bit is part of right effort. Right effort is an essential factor in the path generating desire, upholding your intent, maintaining your persistence to abandon unskillful qualities that have arisen. Notice that the unskillful qualities are there, and you're going to do battle with them. You're going to figure out one way or another to get yourself motivated to stick with the effort. This is one area where desire is actually a helpful thing. The desire to want to do this well is not a bad thing at all. I've been reading a couple of explanations of right resolve, and strangely enough, they interpret the resolve for renunciation to mean the resolve to renounce all desires. But that's not what the Buddha said. Renunciation here means renouncing sensuality, the mind's tendency to waste its time planning tomorrow's sensual pleasures, or your sensual pleasures for the next hour, whatever. You can go over those fantasies for hours at a time thinking about how you would like this, how you'd like it like that, or no, maybe change this little bit here, and so on. You can keep going around and around and around this way, and the mind really feeds on this kind of thinking. That's what we're trying to renounce. If you're aiming to get the mind with the breath, that counts as your intent to get away from sensuality, your desire to get away from sensuality, and you should try to strengthen that. Then you try to figure out ways to remind yourself of why you're doing this, to keep yourself motivated. You can use the principle of heedfulness, realizing that if you can't get some control over the mind now when you're in relatively good health, relatively sane, what are you going to do, say, if pain gets really, really bad, and you start getting delirious? The mind would just jump for anything that seems pleasant. And you know what happens to people who jump at anything, they end up jumping into places they later regret. You want to have some control over the mind so that it doesn't go shooting off into that area. You have to remind yourself of why you don't want to get involved in the waste of time that's sensual thinking. Part of your approach is to keep trying to develop a sense of the pleasure that can come from form, the way you feel the body from within. Whether or not the pleasure comes automatically, the fact that you're aiming in this direction, trying to think of the breath, trying to think of the body right here, right now, as you feel it from within, that's all right effort. As for the complaining voices that may come up, saying that it's a waste of time to meditate, that you're not getting anywhere, you have to learn how to slough those off, too. Don't listen to them. Don't identify with them. Always try to identify with the effort. Ajahn Mun, toward the end of his life, gave a Dhamma talk about going into battle with the defilements. Your determination not to come back and be the laughingstock of the defilements ever again. That's the soldier in his analogy. The soldier has the weapon of discernment and is fed by concentration. But what keeps the soldier going is that firm determination, a firm desire not to be fooled by greed, aversion, or delusion ever again. That's your motivation. That's you right now. And the more you can make that you identify with all the thoughts that cluster around that identity, the easier it'll be to let go of the other identities that would pull you away and say, well, I just want to meditate a little bit so I can have some nice relaxation. I'd like to have a nice, smooth, quiet evening in the mind right now. I don't want to have to work or think or anything. Actually, though, you're here in battle. You've got to do battle with your greed, aversion, and delusion. Sometimes they get really quiet, and it doesn't seem like much of a battle. Other times, they can be really hard to fend off. So you want to work on the skills. You don't want a nice, pleasant, easy meditation, and just satisfy yourself with that. You have to ask yourself, what skills am I learning? Someday greed or anger will come unstrung, and now I have the chance to develop the skills I'll need then, so that I won't get taken in. Now, even though we are in battle, we do want a sense of ease. That's why the Buddha makes concentration with a sense of ease and refreshment an important element of the path. But on the days when the ease and refreshment aren't coming quickly, you have to learn how to feed yourself with something else, and to stick with that determination not to come back, or, at the very least, the determination not to be fooled by your greed, aversion, and delusion again. Otherwise, they'll find some smooth-talking ways to fool you. That's what happens when you give in to the voice that says, this is a waste of time. The meditation isn't going anywhere. I'd be better off doing something else. If you give in to that, they laugh at you, the defilements, they've tricked you again. So you need an element of pride in here, but it's skillful pride. The pride of mastering a skill, a harmless skill, a useful skill, a skill that can take you someplace you've never been before. Now, this skill may take time, but don't think about how far away the goal is, or how long it's going to take. If you don't aim at the goal, life in samsara is going to take even longer, with a lot more suffering along the way. Each step you take, as long as it's in the right direction, is a step well made. Learn how to encourage yourself in that way. That, too, is an important skill to take out of the meditation and into your daily life. There will be times when you'll come up against unexpected difficulties. Things in the world are going in all directions right now. Who knows where they're going to go? So you want the skills of the mind that say, okay, I can handle whatever comes up. I'm not going to be overwhelmed by anything. That's what you learn in the meditation. You realize that one of the big things that weaken you is a mind that's out of control, where you just give in to whatever its mood is. When you start siding with moods that way, who knows where they're going to take you? But even though the mood is there, frustrated, upset, whatever part of the mind is separate, it can watch and not run along with the mood. That's what you need. Without that, you're lost. This separate observer that we're working on here, that can pull out of a thought at least for a little bit, is something you want to develop again and again and again. That's the basis for gaining the control you're going to need, so that your mind doesn't take you places you don't want to go. So remember that even though the pleasure and refreshment are an important part of the meditation, they're not the whole of the meditation. The skills you learn to keep your mind under control, those are the essential parts. Even if they don't come quickly or easily, the fact that they're coming and that you're moving in that direction, that's something that should give you the heart to keep going. Success through maturity. November 2, 2017. There are 4 qualities that the Buddha said can bring about success in the practice of meditation, and in particular, success in concentration: desire, persistence or effort, intentness, and using your powers of judgment wisely. Of those 4, 3 are omitted in modern instructions in meditation. In fact, the 3 are said to be bad in modern meditation. Desire is bad. Efforting is bad. Judging is bad. Even the idea of success is bad. And as for intentness, paying attention carefully to the present moment, the meaning has changed from the way the Buddha used it. A lot of this comes from the fact that most people are taught meditation on retreat in a pressure cooker atmosphere. The retreatants could have gone on vacations on beaches or out in the wilds, but instead, they're spending their time in a meditation hall. So they want something to show for it. To avoid explosions in this pressure cooker, teachers will say, have no goals. There is no such thing as success. There's simply the present moment, which may get people through the weekend or the week or whatever, but doesn't necessarily bring the best results in meditation long term. There was a time when the Buddha once told the monks to practice breath meditation. And one monk said, "Yes, I practice breath meditation." The Buddha asked him, "What kind of breath meditation do you do?" The monk replied, "I put aside hopes and expectations for the future, thoughts about the past, and equanimous in the present moment. I breathe in, I breathe out." Which sounds like a lot of the meditation instructions you may get at a meditation retreat. But the Buddha said, well, there is that kind of breath meditation, but it doesn't give the best results. Then he set forth his 16 steps, which are very proactive. You make up your mind that you're going to breathe in certain ways. Breathe aware of the whole body. Breathe calming the breath. Breathe in a way that gives rise to rapture. Breathe in a way that gives rise to pleasure. Breathe in a way that steadies the mind, gladdens the mind, or releases the mind, depending on what the mind needs. What all of these steps have in common is that they're very proactive. They're aimed at giving rise to certain states, getting the mind into right concentration. There is a purpose to all this. The Buddha's instructions on mindfulness, if they're done right, go right there, to right concentration. One reason for why those bases for success got pushed aside and developed a bad reputation is that people are pretty immature about how they approach their desires, their efforts, and the way they use their powers of judgment. You can't teach maturity in a week, so the teachers try to sidestep the issue entirely. But for a long-term practice, we need to develop maturity, especially in relating to our goals, realizing that we've set ourselves a large task here. To put an end to suffering requires really understanding the mind, training the mind, bringing the mind into states of concentration so that it can see itself clearly. That's a big task. As with any big task, you need to be mature in how you approach it if you want to succeed. The first requirement is realizing that it has to be taken in small steps, but you have to be persistent in taking the steps. This means that you have to have an immediate focus on the present at the same time you take a long view. The immediate focus is for making sure you give full attention to what you're doing. The long view is for learning how to read the results of your actions without getting upset over setbacks. Accept the fact that there will be progress and regress, back and forth, as you get to know the territory of the mind. You have to learn how to bear the task with patience and equanimity, which doesn't mean that you just simply let things slide. It means that you put in the work, you make the effort right here, right now, But you have to be realistic about the goals you're setting for yourself, realizing that the big goals won't yet appear right here, right now. Set interim goals for yourself so that the task isn't too overwhelming, so that you can keep your desire nourished and alive. And, beginning with desire, learn how to be mature in all 4 of these bases for success. Mature desire realizes that effects come about through causes. If you simply sit there wishing for the effects without doing the causes, nothing's going to happen. That kind of desire gets in the way. If you've ever mastered a manual skill as sport, carpentry, cooking, anything that requires time and energy to get really good at it, you've probably learned how to get your desire under control, get it focused on doing the steps right. When the steps are done right, the results will come. In this case, directed thought and evaluation are the causes. You direct your thoughts to the breath. You evaluate the breath so that it's comfortable. If it's not comfortable, you ask yourself, what can I do to make it comfortable? When it finally is comfortable, what do I do to maintain it, to keep that sense of comfort going all the way through each in-breath, each out-breath? As the needs of the body change, how do you change the breath to maintain that comfort? And then how do you let it spread throughout the body, to get the most use out of it? In the Buddha's analogy, it's like mixing water with flour to make dough. You want the water to moisten the entire ball of dough with nothing left over. So you need the sense of pleasure through the body in the same way you'd need the water through the dough. How do you do that? You figure that out, using the help you can get from people like Ajahn Lee and Ajahn Fuang, who have worked on this problem and offered advice. That's the way you focus your desire on desiring to master the skills needed to succeed. And then you try to make your desire single-minded here with the breath. Anything else that comes up right now is of no interest, no importance. That's the kind of attitude you want to develop. You want to make your desire focused, and focused properly on the steps that act as the causes. As for effort, realize that there are many kinds of right effort. There's the effort to prevent unskillful qualities from happening, the effort to get rid of them when they're there, the effort to give rise to skillful qualities, and the effort to maintain and develop them when they're there, all of which are different kinds of efforts. You can ask yourself which kind is appropriate right now. As for the amount of effort, it depends partly on the task at hand, and partly on your strength right now. What level of energy you have, reminding yourself that the effort here is not muscular effort. It's an effort in the mind. The effort to abandon unskillful qualities that have arisen, the effort to prevent unskillful qualities from arising again, the effort to give rise to skillful qualities, and the effort to maintain them so that they grow. These are efforts of the mind that have to be continued even as things start getting comfortable. And this is how effort becomes mature. It's very easy for the mind to start wallowing in a comfortable thought or a pleasant thought that has nothing to do with the meditation, nothing to do with thoughts of skillful or unskillful. It's also easy to wallow in the comfort caused by the meditation. But then you forget the causes, and things fall apart. You have to work at maintaining your focus. Remind yourself that you don't know how many more breaths you have. Each time your heart beats, it's one less beat between you and death. So you want to use those heartbeats. As for intentness, your intent, you pay careful attention to the present moment, but not in a general way. To be maturely intent, you pay attention specifically to what you're doing and the results of your actions. The more sensitive you are to what you're doing, the more you see where your unskillful thoughts are hiding out or where you can improve things. As for using your powers of judgment, it's very important that you not judge yourself as a meditator. To be mature, you judge your actions. Judge your meditation as a carpenter would judge a work in progress. Impersonally, with the purpose of making it better. When things are not going well, learn how to be critical in a useful way, i.e., try to use your ingenuity for the purpose of doing things more skillfully. Figure out what's going wrong and what can be done to change what I'm doing. This is the way the Buddha approached his quest for awakening. He made some pretty big mistakes. 6 years of self-torment. But at the end of those 6 years, he didn't get down on himself. He simply said, well, that's obviously not the way. There must be another way. He depersonalized it. It was simply a matter of actions and results. And then he used his ingenuity. Is there another way? He thought of the time when he was young and had spontaneously gotten into the first jhana. He asked himself, why am I afraid of that pleasure? Because those 6 years of torment were driven by a fear of pleasure. Now he realized that the pleasure of jhana was not a sensual pleasure. It was a skillful pleasure. It caused no harm. It didn't fog the mind. It deserved no blame. So he gave it a try. So learn how to take criticism well, both external criticism and internal criticism. The criticism, to be helpful, is focused on actions and how you can change your actions to yield the results you desire. All these 4 qualities, when they're mature, center on this. Realizing that everything has to be understood as causes and effects, so you desire to do the causes well. You put the effort into doing the causes well. You pay careful attention to what you're doing, sensitive to the results. Then you try to figure out how to make those results better. Those last 2 qualities are well summarized by Ajahn Fuang. I've said many times that the 2 instructions he gave most often when teaching meditation were, be observant and use your ingenuity. Being observant is a matter of intentness. Using your ingenuity is the best way of using your powers of judgment to get yourself past an impasse. This is how these 4 qualities actually do lead to success in the meditation. You attain the goal that the Buddha talked about. In the very beginning, you get the mind into a state of right concentration. From there, you develop insight, again, by looking at what you're doing and being sensitive to your actions and their results. But these bases of success help not only with concentration, but also with the development of discernment, because they force you to be more sensitive to what's possible. And they spur you on to want to keep succeeding on higher and higher levels. As the Buddha said, the total ending of suffering is possible. Listen to that. Total ending. It's not simply a matter of being okay with whatever comes up and passes away. It's not a matter of lowering your expectations. You raise your expectations as to what a human being can do, as to what you as a human being can do. As they say of marksmanship, you don't hit any higher than you aim. So aim high. But learn how to live with a high aim in a mature way, so that your immaturity doesn't get in the way of attaining the goal we all want. Look after your mind with ease. December 14, 2016. May you look after yourself with ease. That's the message of the chant we recite every night, every morning. It's an expression of goodwill. Looking after yourself refers both to your physical and to your mental well-being. Physically, may you be healthy. Or if your health is bad, may it be the sort of problem that you know how to take care of, and it doesn't require too much effort. But more importantly, you want to learn how to look after your mind with ease, so that the issues in the mind are not a constant struggle, and you don't need to be depending on other people to solve your problems for you. You want to be able to see a problem come up in the mind, and also to have another part of the mind that can look at it and see what's wrong, recognize what's wrong, and come up with an antidote. That requires training. And a lot of the training, a lot of looking after your mind, basically means knowing how to talk to yourself. Like right now, we're sitting here, getting the mind to settle down. This requires that you do a certain amount of talking to yourself. You want to do it in a way that's skillful, that actually does bring the mind to a quieter state where you can put all that chatter aside. In the beginning stages, talking to the mind is necessary. Don't think of it as an unfortunate obstacle as you're trying to get the mind concentrated. It's an essential part of the concentration that you learn how to rope in the mind's thoughts and gather them in closer and closer and closer to a sense of stillness. So, right now, talk to yourself about the breath. How is the breath going? Is it comfortable? Where do you feel the breath right now? When you breathe in, does it feel like you're fully nourishing your torso all the way down? Is it nourishing the nerves? Is it nourishing your eyes, your ears? Think of the breath as the flow of energy in the body, and ask yourself where it would feel good for that flow to go. Then, once it feels good, ask yourself how you can make it spread, so that it suffuses the entire body with a sense of well-being. That's a skillful way of talking to yourself. Then you begin to notice at what point the breath is as good as it's going to be, and it's good enough to settle down with. That's when you put the inner chatter aside and just plow into the breath. But to know when that point is, that requires that you talk to yourself, too. So these are some skillful ways of talking to yourself to get the mind to settle down. There are other times when you're not in formal meditation, and you need to know how to talk to the mind, especially when it's getting obsessed with something that's really not good for it. Here your internal chatter can be informed by some reflections on what the Buddha has to say about right speech. To begin with, right speech grows out of right resolve, as we chanted just now. Resolve for renunciation, resolve for non-ill will, and resolve for harmlessness. In terms of renunciation, if you find that the mind is getting obsessed with sensual pleasures or sensual objects, ideas, desires, how do you talk to it so that it can begin to admit that you don't really need those things? Otherwise, the mind will keep saying, I need this pleasure, I need that pleasure. I can't stand not having it. You have to learn how to counter that justification because, after all, you don't really need these things. You can survive perfectly well without them. There are other pleasures that the mind can feed on, like the pleasure of good breathing that will nourish it in a much more substantial way. As for non-ill will, we don't usually think that we have ill will for ourselves, but if you find yourself thinking about giving up on the practice, you have to ask yourself, do you really love yourself? After all, you started this practice because you realized that you were causing yourself unnecessary suffering. And this is the path out of that suffering. Why would you want to give it up? If you really loved yourself, you wouldn't think of abandoning it. The same with the resolve on harmlessness. We don't like to think that we would harm ourselves, but we keep doing things that are really stupid because we don't really care about the consequences. We say, let the consequences take care of themselves. I'm going to do what I feel like doing right now. That's apathy, and it's a way of harming yourself. You've got to think down the line. As the Buddha says, ask yourself, what would be for my long-term welfare and happiness? When you find yourself tempted to give in to a desire to do or say or think something that you know would be bad for you, ask yourself, how will I feel tomorrow from having done this? Remember the times you were able to say no to yourself, and how much better it felt the next day. So these are some of the lessons from right resolve, which are also lessons from right effort. Knowing how you motivate yourself to keep on going. The Buddha has a list of what he calls 3 governing principles, which are different ways of motivating yourself to stick with the practice. First, there's the Dhamma as a governing principle. You reflect on what a good Dhamma this is, how it's hard to find an honest Dhamma like this, and why it'd be a shame to wander away from it. In this case, you use a sense of inspiration to keep you going. This governing principle is based on a sense of appreciation, a sense of gratitude to the Buddha for having taught this excellent Dhamma. Then there's the self as a governing principle. This connects with that question I just mentioned. Do you really love yourself? You see that you're suffering, and a lot of this suffering comes from you. In fact, all the unnecessary suffering comes from your actions. So when are you going to stop? If you put it off to some other lifetime or sometime later in this lifetime, it won't get easier with time. If you're going to love yourself, talk to yourself in ways that keep you going right now. This governing principle is based on goodwill. The third governing principle is based on a sense of shame. The Buddha calls it the world as a governing principle. You remind yourself that there are people in the world who can read other people's minds. Suppose they were to read your mind right now. What would they think? Wouldn't you be ashamed if they saw the unskillful thoughts that you're feeding on right now? These are some lessons from right resolve and right effort to keep in mind as you're chatting to yourself about the practice, about where you're going in the practice, and how you want to stick with it. Then, of course, there are the lessons from right speech itself. As the Buddha said, the things he would talk about would have to be 1. True, 2. Beneficial, and 3. Timely. You can apply the same standards to your thoughts. If something comes up in the mind, ask yourself, is this really true? Some parts of the mind might say, yes, it's really true, but you have to question them. To what extent is the opposite true? What happens if you think in that opposite way? Which leads in a better direction? This is a good break on the type of obsessive thinking that grabs onto one little detail, one little idea, and just runs with it, without any concern about where it's going to go. You have to be able to check yourself. To what extent is this thought out of balance, even if it is true? And is it really true? The mind can convince itself of the truth of all kinds of stupid things. You've got to learn how to step back and question them. I saw a case in my own family years back when my father was going through a severe depression. I came back from Thailand to talk to him, and I found that the best approach was, 1. Not to mention the B word as we were talking, and 2. To let him talk. After a couple days of talking, he sat bolt upright in bed and said something that indicated what the real problem was, something he had been keeping to himself all along. He had been feeling guilty about his first marriage to my mother, and now he was involved in a really bad second marriage. But now he sat up in bed and said, well, maybe if this marriage fails, too, it's not my fault. That was what had been weighing on him for months before I was able to get back. Just learning how to question that the failure of another marriage would be his fault, he got well within the next 3 days. So you may find that you're obsessed with something that you think is really true. Some issue that weighs the mind down, but you don't see any way out of it. You've got to learn how to question it. Sometimes talking to yourself in the right way can bring these things out into the open and clear up all kinds of problems. And of course, even if things really are true, then the next question is, are they beneficial? Is it good for you to be thinking this thought, talking to yourself in this way? Where is this going to lead? Think about the consequences of your thinking. Finally, have a sense of time and place. When is the right time to think? When is the time not to think? When is the time to come down hard on yourself and your internal chatter? And when is it time to be comforting? One of the main defilements that keep people from staying on the path is a tendency to be overcritical with themselves. This is no good, that's no good, I might as well give up. That's what the mind is saying, that's what its defilements are saying. But those thoughts are never beneficial. Those are the times when you have to talk to yourself in a comforting way. Part of the mind will object, saying that comforting thoughts are just Pollyanna-ish ideas. But remember, Pollyanna did well. She wasn't that stupid. You look at all the great Ajahns. They were really good at encouraging themselves. They recognized their faults, that's for sure, but they also recognized that they had good potentials within them, and they found those potentials where other people might not have seen them. After all, most of the Ajahns came from really poor families in a very backward area of Thailand. They didn't have much education. People from outside looking at them would have said, there's no chance, there's no way these people are going to gain awakening. Yet they found that they could. They proved the rest of the world wrong. So you, too, can prove your defilements wrong by defying them. Tell yourself, there's got to be something good here, otherwise I wouldn't have even thought of practicing. Learn to ferret out your good qualities. This ability to talk to yourself skillfully is how you look after your mind. And it can make all the difference as to whether you'll stick with the practice or not. So be very careful about what you say to yourself. If anything that the mind is talking about begins to seem harmful, question it. Because another thing that keeps people from making progress on the path is getting obsessed with an idea that proves to be harmful. So you have to learn how to step back from your obsessions. This is especially important as you're developing powers of concentration, because the stronger your concentration, the more you do tend to get obsessed. After all, you're supposed to be obsessed with the breath right now. But if you're alert, the basic method gives you the tools for turning that obsession into a kind of balance. You're noticing, as the Buddha says, what you're doing to fabricate your sense of the body by the breath, what you're doing to fabricate your sense of the mind by the way you perceive things, i.e., by the images you hold in mind, the words you hold in mind as you meditate. Then you notice what you can do to calm that fabrication, in other words, to bring things into balance, so that a centered state of mind is something you can maintain with ease, something you can stick with for long periods of time, and not feel out of balance. The more you gain a sense of balance with this exercise, the more you'll be able to recognize when your own mind is getting out of balance in other areas. So learn how to talk to yourself with ease, because that's how you look after the mind. In harmlessness is strength. July 7, 2016. A while back, I was reading some introductory pamphlets on Buddhism. And there was a common pattern. They started out by saying that Buddhism is a religion of self-reliance. Then a few pages later they would say that Buddhism teaches there is no self. It's amazing that anyone, after reading those brochures, would continue to be interested. The first statement is actually true. The Buddha teaches us to rely on ourselves. If we're going to find happiness in life, we have to develop the qualities of the path: virtue, concentration, and discernment. Or to develop meritorious activities: generosity, virtue, and meditation. In the course of doing that, we develop a very strong sense of self, a healthy sense of self. But as the practice develops, we find that the sense of self becomes more and more just a concept that we use, a tool that we use. As long as it has its uses, we continue to hold it. It's like a toolbox. There are lots of different cells in there. Some of the cells will be useful for some times, others will be useful other times. There comes a point, though, where you find the ultimate happiness, and you don't need any tools anymore. That's when you can put them all down. But before you put them down, you've got to learn how to use them well. Otherwise, you can't get to the point where you can put them down. The harmless cells in your toolbox are the ones you want to encourage, to put to use. Now, it may seem ironic that part of having a strong sense of self is that you try to make the self as harmless as possible. We tend to think of people with a strong sense of self as often being careless in their treatment of others, but that's not genuine strength. The more you harm others, the more you're creating a debt. The more debts you have, the weaker you are. So we're trying to live a life that's as debtless as possible, which means that we have to look inside to develop the qualities we need for happiness, so that we need to rely less and less on other people. We develop our own mindfulness, we develop our own concentration, our own discernment, so that as we go through life, not only as we're sitting here meditating, but also as we deal with other people, we can be as light as possible. Ajahn Suwat used to make a lot of this point. He was saying the Buddha teaches a lot about how this is not self, and that's not self, but then he gets to that passage we chanted just now: I am the owner of my actions. That's what you want to focus on, because that's where you are responsible. This is our motivation for developing the mind, because all our actions do come out of the mind. Many of us come to meditation for rest and respite. But we stay because we see that once the mind has rested, it can be a lot more skillful in dealing with situations around us. It's just important that you keep in mind the fact that as long as you're acting, there's going to be some burden on other people. For example, with the precepts. The precept against killing comes down to 2 points: you don't kill, and you don't order other people to kill. Sometimes you hear it as a precept of total harmlessness. But that's impossible. Even when you live a vegan lifestyle, it's a burden on some people. The people who have to work in the fields, the bugs that get sprayed. Even with organic produce, it's not that they don't use pesticides. They've just invented organic pesticides. They kill all the same. So we try to live a relatively harmless life as best we can. And in the areas where we do have control over things, we try to be totally harmless. That keeps turning us back on ourselves. Where do we find the strength to maintain that harmlessness? After all, harmlessness requires a lot of care. And the things we used to depend on other people for. We've got to find resources to provide those things from within ourselves. This way, we can go beyond what's just bright action, and turn those bright actions into what the Buddha calls actions that are neither dark nor bright. Those are the ones that take us out of the cycle entirely. Only then can you be totally harmless. This is why they say the arahants are the only people who live in the world without any debts at all. They're still eating the food that other people give them, but the merit that those people gain from feeding the arahants is multiplied many times over. Even the animals that were killed for that food, in case animals got killed someplace in the process, get merit too. In other words, the goodness that the arahants pump back into the world more than compensates for whatever burden they still place on it. But for the rest of us, we're still in a position where we're creating burdens. So we want to keep them as light as possible. Now, this doesn't mean that you don't accept help from other people when they volunteer it. I saw a case years back. A former policeman in Singapore who was constantly afraid of being in debt to other people. He was living in relative poverty. He'd retired from the police force to look after his mother, and they were living on a very small pension. A group of people came one day to bring some food to me, and one woman had prepared extra food so that the policeman could take it home for him and for his mother. But he refused her gift out of fear of being in debt to her. That offended her so much that she cursed him. Literally. She yelled, "I curse you," 3 times. That's being too worried about having debts. When people voluntarily give you help, you accept it, unless the help is inappropriate in one way or another. But as for appropriate help, those should be the kinds of debts you don't mind. It's the cases where you're imposing on other people against their will. That's what you've got to watch out for. And try your best to be as light as possible on the world in general. When the Buddha talks about the principles of the practice that have to do with other people, the primary one is being unburdensome. To be unburdensome, you learn how to be content with what you've got. And to be content with what you've got to develop your sources for true happiness inside. So this issue keeps coming back to what you're doing right here, trying to develop a sense of well-being that you can feed on inside, so that you're not feeding on people outside. This is why developing the pleasure of concentration is not a bad form of clinging. You may be clinging to it, but you're clinging to something good. It's a good attachment. If you don't have this form of pleasure, you're going to go sneaking out and finding your pleasure in other places, not all of which may be skillful, and many of which are harmful both to yourself and to others. So learn to develop the strength of concentration, the strength that comes from having a sense of pleasure and well-being that you can feed on inside. Now, it's important that you have the right attitude toward it, as you're focused on the breath. In other words, you should stay focused on the breath and not on the pleasure. You focus on the breath in a way that gives rise to that sense of pleasure, but then you let the pleasure do its work. You don't have to go running after it or wallowing in it. As long as you're producing it, you've got what you need. The pleasure will do its work. You just allow it to spread around the body. It's in this way that the Buddha said when he was practicing austerities, he didn't let the pain of the austerities overcome his mind, but when he found the pleasure of concentration, he didn't let the pleasure overcome his mind, either. That didn't mean he stopped doing the concentration, he continued doing it, and got deeper and deeper into it, but he stayed focused on his object, even as he kept producing the pleasure. Because, as he said, if you don't have this kind of pleasure, then you keep running back to the pleasure of sensuality. Even though you may know the drawbacks of sensual pleasures, you can contemplate that list of the 32 parts of the body that we chanted just now, over and over and over again. And think about all the other drawbacks of sensual pleasures, but if you don't have an alternative, the mind's going to go sneaking out for a bite of sensuality again. So you've got to develop this source of well-being inside. This is how you become harmless. This is how you become strong, because the strength lies in the harmlessness. When the Buddha began to get disillusioned with his austerities, he recalled the time when he'd gotten the mind spontaneously into jhana when he was a young child. The first question he asked himself was, why am I afraid of that pleasure? Is there anything blameworthy there? Now, a blameworthy pleasure would be one that causes harm to other people and would cloud the mind. There are lots of pleasures in the world that cloud the mind and harm other people. But this doesn't. He realized, as a result, that this was a pleasure he didn't have to be afraid of. So he worked on it, developed it, learned to tap into it whenever he needed it. And it became the main factor of his path to awakening. So allow yourself to find what way of breathing gives the most pleasure, what way of settling the mind with the breath gives the most pleasure. This is a skill you need to develop in order to go through the world both with harmlessness and with strength. Metta through Samvega. September 29, 2017. There's a passage where the Buddha tells of an image that appeared to him before he left home to go out into the wilderness. He saw the whole world as a bunch of fish in a small dwindling puddle, fighting one another over that last gulp of water, before they were all going to die. Everywhere he looked, he saw nothing that wasn't already laid claim to. Everywhere he looked, there was nothing but competition. He wanted to get out. That image describes the feeling called samvega, a sense of dismay or even terror over the way life is lived, and an urgency to want to get out of it. But it's also a useful image to hold in mind when you're thinking of spreading thoughts of goodwill. Goodwill is one of the guardian meditations, in the sense that it guards you from your own defilements. But it's also nourishment. And the image is useful, both to warn you about how to guard yourself, and also how to gain nourishment from goodwill. On the guardian side, it helps you look at the things that might give rise to ill will for other people. And usually, they all come down to the sense of competition. Those other people are getting in the way. They're doing something either to you or to people you love, and there's the sense that you're being violated by their actions. But when you look at the world as basically fish struggling to get that last gulp of water, you begin to realize that the things over which you would compete with other people are not really worth ill will. This isn't to say that, as we normally live in the world, we don't try to make things better than they are. But there are so many things that you realize you can't change, particularly while you're sitting here right now. It's very easy when the mind is quiet and you're off by yourself to start thinking about old wrongs, people who have harmed you, the injustices you've been subjected to. That's when it's good to hold the image of the fish in mind. The things you're competing for, the things you're upset about, are just that last gulp of water, and then everybody's going to die. So why get tied up in ill will? You're harming yourself if you do. So that's the guardian side. As for the nourishing side of goodwill, you realize that the happiness you're looking for now as you meditate is not in competition with anybody at all. Nobody's struggling to get to see your breath. You're not fighting with anyone else as you're trying to get the mind to settle down. It's all internal. You're not harming anyone, and you can take joy in that fact. This is one of the reasons why, when the Buddha talks about practicing goodwill, he says it has to be based on a life of virtue, and a life where you keep your senses under control, or, as he says, you keep your senses calm. In other words, you're not constantly looking for the newest flashy object, or trying to listen to the latest tunes that are attractive. You realize that your true happiness comes from within. You don't have to keep searching outside, because the more you're searching outside, the more you're going to get into conflict with other people. But if you're looking for happiness in a way that's in line with the precepts, you're not harming anybody, and you're not greedy for things, then it's a happiness that's pure. You can take joy in that fact. Your goodwill can be a goodwill that's sincere. It's not hypocritical. If you're harming people, but then you say, I have goodwill for everybody, your actions and your words aren't in line with each other. But if you're holding to the precepts and finding your happiness in ways that are in line with the precepts, you can take joy in the fact that you're not betraying your professions of goodwill. No one's competing with you for your happiness. And this gives energy to your practice. You can settle down and show some goodwill for yourself now by working with the breath, finding a way of breathing that feels good for the body right now. That's goodwill for yourself. And if you can find this sense of well-being inside, you're going to be less hungry for things outside. So you're increasing your ability to find happiness in a way that doesn't get into any conflict, that doesn't require laying any claim. You don't have to push anybody out of the way or away from something they've already laid claim to. So it's good, when you're spreading goodwill, to develop a sense of samvega to go along with it. That makes it a lot easier to step back from the things that you would normally want to fight over. You can say, nope, I don't need to fight over that. I don't need to have ill will for the people who are trying to take that because I've got something better inside. There's a whole range of potentials inside that, once they're developed, can provide you with a happiness much better than anything you could find outside. So you're developing both samvega and the quality called pasada, or confidence, that this is a good path. And as you look at your actions and realize that they don't get into conflict with anybody, your confidence in the path becomes more than just confidence. It becomes something you really know. So on days when you find yourself tied up in thoughts of ill will, think about that image of the fish, realizing that you don't want to be one of those fish. There must be something better. If you're tied up in thoughts of ill will, you're like a fish upset at another fish for taking that gulp of water. But then, they're all going to die. If you can let go of your ill will out of a sense of samvega, and develop goodwill instead, you get yourself out of the puddle of water. Goodwill doesn't mean that you have to like people. And you're not thinking of goodwill as a magic cloud that's going to spread out and make everybody happy. You simply want people to find true happiness, to understand the way to find true happiness, and to actually have the willingness and strength to do that. In one of the phrases where the Buddha describes goodwill, he says, "May these beings look after themselves with ease." You're not necessarily saying you're going to be there for them. You're hoping that they'll be there for themselves, in line with the principle that happiness comes from each person's actions. This way, you can step back from trying to get that last gulp of water. You realize that goodwill is something very easy to develop, even toward people who have taken all the water you might have wanted, because you know you've got something better, or at least the prospect of something better. And that thought will make the mind more inclined to want to settle down and be at ease with the breath, and actually find that something better within. Right resolve in real life. July 11, 2017. Right resolve and right concentration are very closely connected. The beginning of the definition for right concentration says, secluded from sensuality, secluded from unskillful qualities. It refers to the work of right resolve. You're resolving to stay away from sensuality through resolve on renunciation, which means you're not going to let yourself get engaged in sensual thinking. You're resolved on non-ill will, i.e., goodwill. And you're resolved on harmlessness, i.e., compassion, so that you can actually carry out those resolves. Those are the beginning conditions for getting into right concentration. One of the suttas talks about two types of right resolve: mundane and noble. Mundane right resolve is the three resolves I just mentioned. Noble right resolve basically is the first jhana, when you succeeded at clearing out of the mind things like sensuality, ill will, and harmfulness. The concentration also helps with your right resolve, because a lot of these resolves are not easy to stick with. We can think in the abstract that, yes, it would be a good thing to have the mind free from things like sensual obsession, ill will, or harmfulness. But when you actually start living with human beings and putting up with the stresses and strains of daily life, it's very easy to slip into sensuality, ill will, and harmfulness. This is where the concentration helps and gives you another place for the mind to feed, because the things that are going to pull us away from right resolve are mainly two: painful feelings and harsh words. Those are things the Buddha said we should learn how to tolerate. In other words, you have to build up patience and endurance for them. And concentration is really good for building up those qualities. When the Buddha's talking about patience, it's not simply a matter of gritting your teeth and putting up with hardships. It's learning how to find a sense of pleasure even in the midst of hardships, so that you have something to sustain you. Learning how to get a sense of well-being as you settle in with the body, settle in with the breath. That's good sustenance. So the two factors, right resolve, which is an aspect of discernment, and right concentration, go together. The discernment begins with the realization that, as the Four Noble Truths say, if the mind is suffering, it's because of something in the mind. An abbot of a monastery in England was talking one time about a number of members of his community who were complaining all the time about the conditions in the monastery. This wasn't right, that wasn't right. And his analysis was, they don't understand the Four Noble Truths. If you spend your time complaining about things outside, even if you're not complaining out loud, just complaining to yourself, you're going to miss seeing what you're doing to make the situation intolerable and hard to bear. And when you're focused on things outside of the mind, the pains, the unpleasant things, it's very easy to want to go for sensual thinking. As the Buddha said, if you don't see any alternative to pain aside from sensual thinking, that's what you're going to go for. The sensual thinking. Then you start thinking about people who have caused you pain, who have said nasty things to you, done bad things to you, or to people you love or respect or care for. It's very easy to feel ill will for them. And then you think, okay, once they're down, once I have the opportunity, I'm going to get some revenge. That's harmfulness. So you've got to turn your thinking around, and concentration helps give you a foundation for doing that. If you can create a sense of well-being inside and feed on that, you're less likely to be feeding on things outside, and less likely to be complaining about them. You can notice that something's not right, but if it's not interfering with your internal food source, it's a lot easier to bear with it. The things that we have trouble bearing with are the ones that we bring inside, the things we try to feed on. Sometimes you bring them inside simply by the way you breathe. You get upset about something and your breath changes and becomes intolerable. It's not the situation that's intolerable. It's your breathing that's intolerable, but you lash out. So you constantly have to be on the lookout for when the breath changes. One of the reasons why we practice here sitting with our eyes closed, focusing on the breath, is to make ourselves more and more sensitive to this aspect of the body and its relationship to events in the mind. Then we can take that sensitivity out into our other activities, so that when someone says something displeasing or harsh or nasty, we look immediately at our breath to make sure that the breath doesn't get affected. Remember the image the Buddha taught to Rahula when he said, meditate like wind. That's breath as part of the wind element. It doesn't mean that you blow your mind around. It means that wind can blow disgusting things around, but the wind doesn't get disgusted, in the same way that when it blows pleasant things around, it doesn't get elated. It's just wind. So, when there are good or bad things in your environment, try to keep your mind, just awareness. Try to keep your breath on an even keel. When you've got the breath on your side, that's half the battle right there. Otherwise, your greed, aversion, and delusion hijack the breath and hold it hostage. They say, okay, we're going to be making a lot of unpleasant feelings here in your body until you do something in line with what we want. And only then will we let it go. That's a pretty high price, because what they want you to do can often be very unskillful. And you'll be the one to pay the price, not them. So don't let them take the breath hostage. Try to be on top of how your breathing feels and learn how to breathe in a way that feels good, even when things are falling apart around you, because that way your head will be a lot clearer in spite of the situation, and you can think of the most skillful thing to do. When you're not stabbing yourself with events around you, you can fall back on the mantra we talked about today. I can take this. I can take this. You can survive these things because you're not bringing them in to wear yourself down. This doesn't mean that you're totally passive. When you see something out of line, something that's inappropriate, and you have the ability to change it, go ahead and change it. But there are a lot of things in the world, a lot of people in the world, that are very hard to change. But, as the Buddha pointed out, when we're living with things we don't like or are separated from things we do like, the suffering is not in the things that we like or don't like. It's with the clinging and the craving, which means you've got to look inside. This is what right resolve deals with. It reminds you that craving and clinging are the things you've got to watch out for. Sensual craving is number one. You've got to be very alert and very attuned to the harm done by a lot of your sensual fantasies. Even if you don't act on them, they get the mind in a certain mood. It starts getting sloppy. When it starts getting sloppy, this little slip doesn't matter. That little slip doesn't matter. All I want is my pleasure. That's the attitude it has. And then when you do start acting out on these things, you can cause yourself a lot of trouble. You can cause other people a lot of trouble, too. So the concentration is there to give you an alternative pleasure. It's the combination of discernment and concentration, seeing the drawbacks of sensuality and having this alternative pleasure. That's what enables you to get past that sloppiness. When you're dealing with difficult people, confronted with feelings of pain and harsh words, having a place of concentration really helps. Even if you can't occupy the whole body and fill it and suffuse it with pleasure down to every last cell, the fact that you have some part of the body that you can make comfortable allows you to find your sustenance there, so that you have the strength to deal with the pain, the strength to deal with the unpleasant words. Because you've got this alternative source of food, you're not out there stuffing those things into your stomach and then finding that they give you indigestion. Ajahn Lee says when someone else spits out some nasty words and you take them inside to think about, it's as if they've spit something on the ground and you've picked it up and are eating it. Of course you're going to get sick. And who are you going to blame? You were the one who picked it up. So even though people are aiming their words at you, you have to learn how to sidestep them and see the words as their karma, as having nothing to do with you, even though they're saying your name over and over again. Just remind yourself that they're aiming at their concept of you, and they're not aiming directly at you. You're not their concept of you, so they can't hit you at all. In Thailand, one of the insults commonly hurled around is to call someone else a dog. And the different Ajahns have interesting ways of dealing with that. Ajahn Fun says, they call you a dog. You look around. You don't have a tail. And they don't have tails either. So if you're a dog and they look like you, then they must be dogs as well. Or Ajahn Lee's way of saying it, you look around you. You know that dogs do have tails. You look at yourself. You don't have a tail. Okay, what they're saying isn't true. But there is an advantage when they call you a dog, he adds. Dogs have no laws. They're free to do as they like. So whatever the insult, learn how to look at it in a way that gets you out of the line of fire and allows you to see some humor in the situation. When you can laugh at their insults, you're far away from them. They can't hit you. Now, don't laugh out loud at them because that'll cause trouble. But you can laugh to yourself. There's a story in the canon where the monks are walking along as a group, and a teacher from another sect together with his student are following behind them. The student is praising the Buddha, and the teacher is denouncing the Buddha. The monks got upset because of the teacher's denunciation of the Buddha, but the Buddha told them, even when run-of-the-mill people praise me, they don't know what they're talking about. So why should I get upset when they're denouncing me? Try to develop the attitude that if there really is something true about what they say, you can learn. Otherwise, you just let it go. You can live with a lot of things in this world and not get tempted to do unskillful things in response. Because that's the main problem. When people do unskillful things to us, there's an immediate tendency for us to turn around and do unskillful things to them. And that goes for things that we like as well as for things we don't like. So we've got to learn how to resist the temptation to respond to the unskillful things that we like in unskillful ways, or to respond to the unskillful things that we don't like in unskillful ways. Right resolve helps right concentration because it brings in the element of discernment. Simply learning how to breathe well, simply learning how to be calm in the face of something, doesn't deal with the whole problem. There's still the problem of the I and the me that gets in the way and feels injured by these things. If you can learn how to take those concepts apart to see whatever I you have doesn't need to be in the line of fire and isn't harmed by the other things that other people do to you, then you put yourself in a position of safety. Safe not only from what they say, but also from your own potential unskillful reactions. That way, you really can carry right resolve into the world with all of its messiness and keep your resolve intact. This principle applies to all the factors of the path. They're not designed simply for situations where practice is easy and conditions are good. They're meant to be followed all the time. When they're easy, when they're hard, when the world outside is supporting you, when the world outside is not supporting you. You want to have the wherewithal in terms of your virtue and your concentration and your discernment to protect your path, i.e., to protect your thoughts, your words, and your deeds, to keep them in line with what you know will ultimately lead to true happiness, to the true end of suffering. When you keep that goal in mind, you realize that a lot of the other baggage that you tend to carry with you is an unnecessary burden, and you can let it go. In harmony with the teachings of the Buddha, we emphasize the profound importance of sharing wisdom far and wide. Presently, we've made this extensive 1,000-page work accessible through audio format. The responsibility to further this noble cause now rests with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and the sharing of our content, you play a central role in the broad dissemination of these teachings, which can benefit numerous others. Let's continue the timeless tradition of spreading knowledge and nurturing mindfulness for the betterment of humanity. We wholeheartedly invite you to join us in this endeavor, and together, we can make a profound and positive impact on the lives of many.